Hi, welcome to another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. I'm your host, Ruthie Blum, and my co-host, Mark Regev, is joining me this week from London. Hi, Mark.
Good morning, Ruthie. I understand it's a sunny, beautiful day in Israel, and here in London, maybe not atypically, it's a touch gray.
Oh, well, I would expect that. So, listen, before we start, I would like to first remind anybody who's interested to register for JNS's first International Policy Summit that's taking place in Jerusalem on April 27th and 8th. You can register by clicking on the banner on our video or by going to jns.org and clicking on the box that is on the website. Aside from that, I'd also like to request to anybody who likes this broadcast, please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Okay, so now we're going to get started on more serious topics. And I'd like to begin with the almost violent protests that have been taking place in Israel daily, not just on Saturday nights. And the latest reason for them, there's always a different reason. Sometimes it's the hostages, sometimes it's just anti-Prime Minister Netanyahu, and other times it's just everything in the kitchen sink. And the latest excuse is the sacking of the Shin Bet chief, Ronen Bar. That's our version of the FBI. And so suddenly all these people who normally would oppose him because he's the figure most responsible for not having warned about and prevented the October 7th massacre, the only reason that these people are now rushing to come to his side is that Netanyahu fired him.
So I'll first of all need to say what has to be said, and that is Israel's a democracy and people have the right to protest. That's part of any democracy. You can agree with them, you can disagree with them, but protest is a fundamental right in every democratic society. What you are correct, and there are always, I don't think there's a black and white answer, to what extent if people are blocking roads, if people are making bonfires on roads, if people are preventing lawmakers from reaching the Knesset so that they can cast their vote, to what extent is that acceptable protest? That's a different question. And I think we've got to find the right balance here between people who are exercising their democratic right to express their opinion, like it or not, everyone has that right, between people who's through civil disobedience or other manifestations of protest are actually harming other people, right? Preventing them from getting where they need to go and so forth. And in Israel, usually what I think is being done is that the police will allow a temporary closure of road, but then they'll come in and open it up because they'll say it's unfair to everyone else if a road is closed for a long time. Preventing members of parliament to enter the Knesset so that they can exercise their vote. Okay, I think that's debatable. Though to be fair, during the Oslo period, I think right-wing protesters did it to members of the Rabin government. So maybe there's a precedent for that, Ruthie.
Okay, Mark. As much as I appreciate your even-handedness, I believe right now there is not only a seven-front war going on against Israel, but there's also a war of ideas going on. And I believe that a person has to pick sides in that war. Nobody suggests that protests aren't legitimate in Israel and in a democracy. But we have leaders. The leader of the opposition here, Yair Lapid, got up on stage and he called for civil war. He called for people to cease paying taxes. I mean, that's anarchy. Okay. And then the head of the what is no longer the Labor Party, which died, but the left-wing Labor Merits Party called the Democrats, ironically, Yair Golan, there's two Yairs here. Yair Golan also, he said, we should shut down the economy, the airport, the ports, the banks, the everything, the schools. And then the head of our major umbrella labor federation union is also saying we're going to shut down the economy. And then there are heads of the businesses saying we're going to shut down the economy. Now, we have 59 hostages still in Gaza. And these protesters claim, and have been claiming throughout the war, that the goal is to free the hostages. Never mind that most of them are blaming Netanyahu for the lack of although he has secured the release of many, blaming him for those who remain in Gaza, despite the fact that he has said yes to every proposal, reasonable proposal, not Hamas's unreasonable ones. Furthermore, the protest movement, one of the things everyone agrees in the protest movement is that all the hostages should be released and not just one or two or five. And he agrees with that, and yet they're still attacking him for not managing to bring all of them on one bus out of Gaza. So I'm now not talking about the right to demonstrate or protest. I'm talking about civil disobedience, calling for civil war, and I believe they're totally endangering the hostages. They are weakening Israel's position vis-a-vis the negotiators, and all Israel's enemies are watching.
So I'll take what you said and I'll say where I agree and I'll say where I disagree. First of all, I thought what Yair Lapid said, and he really did, was very strident and, said we're going to close down the country and stop to pay taxes. And I think it was a function of his difficult political situation. Because since Reserve General Yair Golan, the new leader of the left, who's as you said correctly, he's united two parties that have had very a lot of electoral misfortune over the last few rounds of elections. Their numbers have gone down. Meretz didn't even pass the cutoff point to enter the Knesset, and Labour only got in barely with 4. But he's united the two parties of the left, and he's gone up in the polls, and in many polls I've seen, he's actually passed Lapid, who's the official opposition leader. And this is obviously disturbing Lapid, that his numbers are going down. Obviously, the left isn't taking votes from Likud voters, but they're taking Yesh Atid, they're taking Lapid voters. And so I think I don't justify Lapid's statements. I think he was wrong to say what he did. But I think the political motivation is he feels he's been outflanked by Yair Golan, who's being strident, who's being very radical, who's saying very, very, very harsh things. And he's seen his numbers go up and Lapid's own numbers go down. And I think this is his response. He is the leader of the largest party in the Knesset, the largest opposition party in the Knesset. He is the leader of the opposition. But the polls for him have been difficult. For all sorts of reasons, and I think what we're seeing is his response to that in the polls. Maybe he believes, and I think he'd be wrong in believing this, that he can out Yair Golan. I think that would be from his point of view, and maybe we saw that when he spoke this week. I think that's a failed strategy for him. I don't think that's going to help him, because I don't think he can be more Yair Golan than the genuine Yair Golan. On the issue of the strikes and business people closing down their businesses in protest, so they've threatened to do that if the Supreme Court takes a decision, which it has not taken so far, to renew the decision, to reject the decision, to annul the decision by the government to fire the head of the security services. So we're not there yet. We have to see what the Supreme Court does. It was very interesting. The Attorney General, who is sometimes more difficult for the government than the Supreme Court itself, and she's supposed to be on the side of the executive branch, but she's, as I say, she can be more against the government than the judiciary, who's supposed to give judicial review. But having said that, she ruled, the Attorney General, that the Prime Minister wasn't even in this interim period before the Supreme Court makes its choices. She ruled that the Prime Minister can't even start a process of selecting a new person to head the security services, to head the Shin Bet. And that was overruled by the Supreme Court. And we don't know which way the Supreme Court will go when it finally reaches its decision on this issue. But you are correct when you say the heads of the Trade Union Federation in Israel, Histadrut, and heads of different business associations have said if the government, in their opinion, illegally does not accept a decision taken by the Supreme Court, they will do a national strike. Now, once again, like protests, the tool of strikes, yes, is a legitimate tool in democracy, though the labor courts in Israel in the past and in other democratic countries have said if strikes are about wages and conditions, they're legitimate. When strikes are not political, questions are political and not about the rights of the workers, they have ruled sometimes that these strikes are not effective. Not legal under the law. And there'll be a whole issue there if there are strikes for political reasons, whether that is acceptable behavior or not acceptable behavior. Different Western countries have dealt with these issues. To what extent can unions strike? To what extent can you close down businesses for political reasons? If I have a department store, I don't, yes, but if I did, it's my private department store. Am I entitled to close it down as a matter of, political protest? It's a legitimate question. You could argue it's my private property and I can do with it what I like. A trade union will say we are exercising our right to express our opinions. The labor courts will decide if that's legitimate or not. It's a question. If you're not using violence, if you're using democratic tools, once again, I might disagree with what they're saying, but do they not have the right to protest in that way? I think, Ruthie, I might not like it, but is that not what democracy is all about?
No. Democracy is not all about undermining it by using illegal tools. Now, I'd like to step back for a second, and I would like you to listen to how you described the protesters saying that if Netanyahu doesn't abide by the Supreme Court's ruling, then all hell will break loose, okay? But that's because they are already assuming, and justifiably so, that the Supreme Court is going to rule against Netanyahu. They didn't, first of all, if the Supreme Court, it's actually the High Court of Justice. This is a petition to the High Court of Justice. If the High Court of Justice rules against Netanyahu's firing of Ronen Bar, that will be an illegal ruling. Israeli law says that Netanyahu is Ronen Bar's boss. That's true, by the way, in all democracies. He's the prime minister. Ronen Bar is his underling, is an appointed official, not an elected one, and he is subordinate to the prime minister, and the prime minister can, at will, fire him by law. If the court rules otherwise, it will be the court violating the law, not Netanyahu. And if the protesters are saying they already assume, knowing the bent of the courts, they already assume that the court is going to rule against Netanyahu, and that's why they're saying if he doesn't abide by the ruling, they're going to shut down the economy. That's it. Everything is asked backwards here. Now, I don't know why you have to keep defending them. We're at war. I'll tell you, there are things called emergency measures. We have not implemented them. We haven't prevented any protests. But how about this side of the protests? These are a released hostage named Omer Shem Tov met on Tuesday with President Herzog. And in his meeting, he said that while he was in Gaza, his captors occasionally would show him Israel TV, show him the demonstrations, and say, you see, Israel is imploding. And that's great. That emboldens Hamas when Israel implodes. Omer Shem Tov was telling the president that it's really necessary for us to exhibit unity. Now, obviously, you can't force people to exhibit unity. And to tell you the truth, I don't feel unity with those people I consider now anarchists. Not all the protesters. I know you're about to say not everyone. Okay, no. The hardcore leading these protests are calling for anarchy at a time when the Hamas, which we know has said in the past, before October 7th, it was watching us in the protests in the street and it was carefully monitoring it. Now, here's another interesting thing. The Shin Bet chief, Ronen Bar, in his anger at being fired, he said, no, I refuse to be fired. And he wrote a long letter to the cabinet saying that he considers his firing illegitimate, and the reasons he wasn't given sufficient excuse, he wasn't, that Netanyahu didn't provide sufficient grounds to fire him. Not that Netanyahu needs any, by the way. So this long letter in which Bar hinted and said also that this is not right, and that he hinted that Netanyahu has his personal reasons that are illegitimate for wanting to fire him, and it all has to do with some investigation that he's conducting. All right? And guess who right away released a statement quoting Ronen Bar's letter? Hamas. So we don't even need more proof that Hamas is using these talking points of the protest movement and of anybody against Netanyahu to bolster its position. This is reckless endangerment. It also weakens the war effort. Our government right now is in discussions with the Trump administration. We're trying hard to pressure Hamas to release more hostages, and we're not even giving the full force of our military to do so in order to give a chance to release more live hostages. And these people taken to the streets, and by the way, they are being violent. They are definitely being violent, and they are hoisting up signs that call Netanyahu Hitler and everything else. This is outrageous and shouldn't be acceptable. So whether it's legal or not, which is debatable, okay, it is unacceptable. There is such a thing as immoral, unethical, and just not right during wartime. And these people ought to be ashamed of themselves.
So, first of all, I agree with you on the point that these protests are playing into the hands of Hamas, in that they are giving Hamas the feeling that if they hold strong enough on their hardline, irrational positions, yes, then eventually Netanyahu and the government will have to capitulate to public pressure. And I'd like to remind our viewers, they will probably have forgotten this, but I recall the previous Prime Minister, the previous Prime Minister, no friend of Netanyahu, Mr. Ehud Olmert. And he said during the time of the Galit Shalit protesters, and I recall him saying this, he said that the protesters in the street who might be motivated for good reasons and they just want to see this young soldier return to home, their mass protests, he said, made it more difficult to get a deal to get that young soldier out. Those protests undermined Israel's negotiating position. And I've got no doubt that is the situation again today. And there's a left-wing journalist who I think you don't like him very much, a man called Regev Drucker. I heard him say the same thing on Israeli television just a few weeks ago, that you can't dispute the fact that the protest movement on the issue of the hostages gives fuel and gives hope to Hamas. Once again, the belief that we can hold out, stand firm from a Hamas's perspective, and then just wait for the public pressure on Israel to grow, inside Israel, on the government to grow, and in the end they'll capitulate and Hamas will get its demands through. And I think that cannot be denied. You can also not deny at the same time that the hostage families themselves, you have to feel for them, you have to understand for them. It doesn't mean they should dictate the policy for the country, but when hostage families speak out the way some of them do, we have to listen because they are under immense pain and suffering. On the issue of the hostages themselves, and, should we try to get some of them out? Should we try to get all of them out? I'll give you my opinion. I think Hamas will never release all the hostages, because from Hamas's point of view, the hostages is the only leverage that they've got, and they will never voluntarily release them all. And therefore, if you say today, all or nothing, you could well end up with nothing. That's why I think it's correct. And as we speak, as we're recording this podcast, I believe Minister Ron Dermer is in Washington talking to the administration with Steve Witkoff and so forth about how we move forward on this. But I think we've beefed up the military pressure. If we can get another group of, and I agree with you, we have to prioritize the live hostages over unfortunately, the ones who are no longer among the living, to get live people out. If we can get a small but, like as large as possible group of live hostages out, we should be willing to agree to another ceasefire. If we can get live people out, I believe we should do that. And I think if you say we have to get them all out, once again, I'm afraid of a situation where all or nothing means nothing. Let's get as many people out as we can. I think there's something in Judaism, and I don't pretend to be a spiritual leader or a rabbi or anything like that, but I think it's written somewhere that any life you save is a world unto itself. Let's get as many people as is possible to get out. If we can do that, that's a good thing.
Okay, well, that's true. But, something our hearts also bleed not just for the families of the hostages, by the way, who are not all in agreement about how to get their loved ones home. It's just that the ones who believe in military pressure are not being interviewed on the left-wing TV channels. That's it. They are silenced by people like Raviv Drucker, whom you mentioned. You also mentioned Ehud Olmert, who said that during the Shalit deal that this was making it harder to negotiate. And that same Olmert is going around TV studios and saying that Netanyahu is a criminal, he doesn't want the hostages home. He's doing exactly what he accused those people of doing back then. So it's just appalling. And there are a whole other list of has-beens, like our former Supreme Court President, Aaron Barak, who said appalling things the other day in a series of interviews. So, but I would like to just move on. What we can do now, you were talking about protests, legitimate, not legitimate. Let's talk about now the protests that are going on in Gaza against Hamas and in Turkey against Erdogan. What a difference those countries, what a difference those protests make. What I mean is, in those countries, in Gaza is not a country. In Gaza, Hamas is trying to shoot down the protesters, and they've had it. Okay, that Hamas has ruined their lives, and we don't know how many are doing it. I've read that it's hundreds, not thousands, but who knows? That's one thing. And then you have the protests in Turkey against Erdogan, who jailed his rival for the presidency. Israel does nothing of the sort. If anybody tries to put anyone in jail in Israel, it is the left-wing elites, deep state, in other words, unelected officials, trying to do it to Netanyahu and other elected officials. So, you really cannot even question Israel's democracy in this. All you can do is question why Israel caves to the demands of protesters who have no business endangering or weakening our war effort.
So, Ruthie, I want to disagree with something that you've said. But before I say that, I want to say that I support judicial reform. I think the power of our Attorney General, who's supposed to be the legal advisor to the government, it really is unprecedented in any democratic country. I think our Supreme Court, which I can say many good things about, but there's no doubt that it has an extremely activist court that has usurped too many of the powers of the executive in an incremental way over the years. And the pendulum between the power of the judiciary opposite the power of the elected branch of government has swung too much to one side and needs to swing back. I believe that very strongly, and I support the reform proposal about electing justices that is now before the Knesset. Having said all that, I think you overstate and incorrectly make your point, because I'll remind you of two prime ministers who were not of the right, who were taken down by judicial activism in Israel. Most famously was Yitzhak Rabin in 1977, who many people believe that later on he became Justice of the Supreme Court, but then Attorney General Aaron Barak made a situation where he had this, he could have paid a fine, he could have had a minor reprimand, a rap on the knuckles, but ultimately he was pushed in a situation where he felt he had to resign. And he was brought down by his own Attorney General. And then, of course, Olmert, the old Attorney General, opened a whole series of corruption and other trials against Olmert, and he was brought down by the Attorney General. So I think one can, at least historically, separate between the left and right issue and the issue of the power of the judiciary, which in Israel has, I think, our checks and balances are out of sync. Yes, these people have too much power. They're not criticized. I read a book recently, an autobiography written by Chaim Ramon, who was on the left. He was a peace activist. He was a Labour Party member. In the end, he joined Kadima with Sharon, and he was brought down also by the judiciary. And most people think that it was ridiculous what they did to him, but he nevertheless suffered by a judiciary which is overly intrusive, and there are not enough checks and balances on its behavior. It's not open to criticism inside the system the way the executive branch is. And I think Israel needs judicial reform, and it's not necessarily a left or right issue. I would say the following also, and I think it needs to be said. You can find quotes from people like Rabin, from people like Ramon, from even people who are in merits like Avraham Poraz and other people, Zava Golon, who've talked about judicial overreach in Israel, where the judiciary has usurped powers that belong to the elected branch. It has become a left-right issue in Israel over recent years because of the polarization in our society. But if you actually look at the content of the issues, it shouldn't be and didn't used to be.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not to go into every single case you brought up, but it is a left-right issue in the sense that Aaron Barak is a far left-wing, he's a retired Supreme Court president, but he's like the oracle. They make their pilgrimage to him to hear what he has to say. He is on the far left, and the judges, since they appoint one another and themselves, it has turned into a far left court. And it isn't a question of whether they also ruled against other left-wingers. Today, you have a court that is willing to give standing to Hamas terrorists and rule on, it's just outrageous. Okay, it is outrageous. And their rulings always go to the left. But it doesn't even matter if they were on the right. I would also say this. Their powers, you're right, they've exceeded their powers. Aaron Barak said so. He said, this is a constitutional revolution. He was proud of it. And his view is that actually there's riffraff out there who don't know any better. And these judges on high know better than the public who elects its officials. And therefore, we have a set of elites in robes who will make our decisions for us because we are too stupid to do so. So it's not just, we need to reform the judiciary. We need a whole overhaul. But that isn't the issue right now. I mean, obviously it is because Netanyahu's hands have been tied by the courts, and not only by the courts, by the whole unelected officialdom. I'm just saying that at the moment we are in an existential war, and we don't need internal strife. That all it does is encourage the enemy and Iran, which, by the way, now I would like to move on to that also, because we haven't mentioned that in Iran there are also protests going on now. And unlike democratic governments in the United States that basically said, looked the other way or said, we have to respect what the Iranian people want at the ballot box, which is a big joke. The Trump administration has now said to Iran, you have 2 weeks to come to the negotiating table over the nukes we will not prevent you from having, or you're going to suffer severe consequences. And I believe that Ron Dermer, you mentioned before, Ron Dermer is also in Washington to discuss that issue, which is, of course, connected to all the others, because it's Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon and jihadis in Syria and the Houthis in Yemen. All of these are Iranian proxies that are need to be wiped out. And also, the minute Iran is weakened and doesn't have nuclear weapons, the rest of the Middle East will fall more into place.
And maybe I can finish off our weekly podcast by saying something moderately optimistic. And that is, the fundamentals of the region are as follows. Arabs and Israelis are united in supporting an American tough approach towards Iran. We live in the region. We see what Iran did. And at the moment, we can say over the last few months, the Iranians have received blow after blow. Their proxy regime in Syria, Assad, fell from power. Hezbollah, which ran the show in Lebanon, their power has been greatly contained. They haven't been destroyed completely, but they have been taken off their high chair, and they are no longer the power that they used to be in Lebanon. The West, led by the United States, the international coalition, is hitting the Houthi proxies of Iran hard almost every day, repeatedly, when in the past their sort of reign of terror against shipping and against others was sort of largely ignored, or they were given a soft slat on the wrist. And as you said, crucially, the United States has said to Iran, either you negotiate seriously or we will take other steps. And I think this is something people need to understand. It's not just the Israeli government wants to see a harder line on Iran. It is the Arab governments. This is the region as a whole. There is a moment of opportunity now after the events of the last year, where Israel successfully took out Iranians' air defenses, their radar. They are more open. They're more vulnerable than ever before. They've lost their allies. They've lost their proxies. That's made them even more vulnerable than ever before. This is a time to try to create a new reality. Now, the people of Iran want a different regime. There's no doubt about that. The people of Iran have been out there protesting, and they've been paying with their lives for freedom, for a different regime, for a regime that represents them more. I'm not sure the international community can bring about regime change. Maybe that only the Iranian people can do. But we have to act forcibly to contain Iran, to prevent Iran from getting a bomb, from preventing Iran from extending its power, reasserting its power and authority. That's something that's good for Israel. That's something that's good for the Middle East. That's something that's good for the world. We have a moment of opportunity, and I hope and I pray that the Americans who have to lead this effort will be up to the task.
Well, I have to agree with you there, Mark. Absolutely. I say amen to that. And let's hope that that is what unfolds in the very near future. So on that note, we'll be signing off and seeing you next week.
And I will be next week in the studio with you and look forward to being there.